Hi, everybody. Welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. Ever since I moved to Independence, Missouri, I've become very interested in Community of Christ. They are now my next door neighbors. Whenever you go to the temple lot, you see their very large buildings, the auditorium, and the spiral temple. And I've seen a lot of things going on with this church since I moved here. And this is the latest thing. Uh, I have thought before that this new podcast that they've created on the church website called Onward is meant to engage with the church, and that is its stated purpose, is to engage with the church and have dialogue. But I have felt that it was created because there are changes coming. And this isn't the most recent episode, it's the second most recent, but in episode 7, they are contemplating some big changes that would potentially affect church membership, like the official number of members of their church, as well as changing, modifying, putting aside the age of accountability, which they have held. And it seems like as of right now, they still hold is the age of 8, which comes from Doctrine and Covenants. But it's interesting because they're moving further and further and further away from their roots, which is no surprise, but this is just the latest chapter in this. So what I want to do is look at that and the implications of it. And it's fascinating, but we have to go back to this. We're going to go to my spreadsheet called Quotes A through Z. This is currently row 128 for Community of Christ, or RLDS, as they used to be known. I have this from Elder Alvin R. Dyer. At this time, he was assistant to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. He's the one that was made a member of the First Presidency as the church was purchasing lands here in Missouri. This is in a talk that he gave in 1967 at BYU at a devotional called The Center Place of Zion. And this is how it starts out. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this is just how it starts out. I'm going to read the top and then the red part. I feel this morning to begin my remarks to you, bearing my testimony to you as a servant of God, that Joseph Smith is truly a prophet of God. Later on, each of the successors of the prophet Joseph Smith have upon many occasions bore witness to the faithful completion of his work. President Joseph F. Smith, who was the nephew of Joseph Smith, who became the 6th president of the church. President Joseph F. Smith, who knew the prophet as a boy, gave his testimony of his work. Quote, Joseph Smith was true to the covenants that he made with the Lord, true to his mission, and the Lord enabled him to accomplish his work, even to the sealing of his testimony with his shed blood. And now I'm going to read the red part. I say this with regard to the fact that the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in their hidden documents, proclaim Joseph Smith to have been a fallen prophet. And even to this day, there is written in the crevices of their philosophy, in their teachings, this concept which nullifies the position that they attempt to hold in the world. And I didn't know what that meant. What are the hidden documents? Well, thankfully, I got an email from Anonymous. I am going to show you that I did get an email, and this is where I found out about this. This anonymous email pointed me to something called the Presidential Papers and the Position Papers. And I needed to know this because I'm still learning more about the history of this place, both what our church has been doing in Missouri, as well as Church of Christ Temple Lot, as well as Community of Christ. And with Community of Christ, up until this point, my understanding was that the thing that primarily caused this big schism back in the 80s was the ordaining of women to the priesthood. As of right now, the new prophet, president of Community of Christ, is a female. It's Stacy D. Cram. It's their first female prophet president. But when that happened in the 80s, there was this big falling out where those that were more to the left seemed to have stayed with the church, and then those that were more conservative fell away from it, and they're in a current state of disarray, collectively known as the Restoration branches, but they're all autonomous. But my understanding is that there's factions, and then there's some that have kind of come back together and created new denominations like Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But it wasn't just the ordaining of women to the priesthood. There was trouble stewing before that point, and that can be found in these papers. So what I did is I went over to 23rd Street, and as far as I know, this is the only physical bookstore that you can go to as someone who comes from the RLDS tradition to purchase books that have been published in the past. I don't know if there's any new books, but if you're part of the Restoration branches, essentially, this is a store you can come to purchase books and materials and stuff like that. It's like their version of Deseret Book, but they just have the one location on 23rd Street. And thankfully, they did. They had, I didn't know if I would find it there, but they did have copies of the position papers and the presidential papers. And just to give you a taste of what these are about, so these were not meant for public consumption. I guess somebody got a hold of them a long time ago and made photocopies of them, and now they're being published and sold in places like the Restoration Bookstore. But what they did, putting it into a book, they put this on the cover just to give you an idea of what's inside. So from page 57, nor can we affirm today that this is the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth, with which the Lord is well pleased. We affirm that no single organized institution or church on earth is the perfect embodiment of God's will and purpose. And then from page 107, but even the type of Christology that the Book of Mormon displays raises questions for the modern man, since it seems to reflect the 19th century messianic view of Jesus as a supernatural being. Okay, so they're getting rid of the idea of the one true church, which at one time they did believe, just like we do. They're getting rid of the idea of Christ as a supernatural being, which we hold that he is. I guess we wouldn't use the word supernatural so much as he is divine. He's resurrected. He has a perfected body. But you can see that there were some pretty big shifts that came to the church with these papers. And it's not just that. It's the Book of Mormon. It's the prophet Joseph Smith, just like what Elder Alvin R. Dyer said in that first thing that I read to you. The presidential papers, let's just look at this. These ones came later. Page 28, the apostasy and the restoration were not events that happened. So now just throwing out the idea of the restoration. Page 42, the Latter-day belief in Zion derives from the philosophy of John Calvin. And then page 100, this is from Apostle Alan Tyree of their church. Our place is in the midst of the mixture, meaning the World Council of Churches. So Community of Christ is an ecumenical church, meaning that they essentially try and integrate with other churches. It's like, it seems like it's like a club of churches, just like what it sounds like. It's not really that important if you're in our church or their church. Like, we all believe in Christ. We're all on the same path, and there's just different ways to do it. That's what it is in a nutshell. That's my understanding. Okay, so I'm probably going to revisit these sometime in the future, but when you read them, both of these books, it's pretty bad. A lot of it reads like anti-church church material, essentially. Like, members of the church, people who've left the church, now they're just really against it. And they try and poke holes in church history or our theology. That's essentially what these are. These are like anti-church materials. So, um, so that's what has led us up, it seems, to this point. This is the newest thing that we're going to cover. Now, last year, like I said, Stacy D. Cram became the first female prophet president of the church, which I think itself represents a further departure from what they were and an indication of where they're going. I have wondered on this channel if this is going to lead to them selling their independence properties. The auditorium and the temple sit on temple land. It's not just the one temple lot owned by Church of Christ Temple Lot, which is another church, much tinier. But there's supposed to be a 24 temple complex, and someday that'll come to fruition. I don't know when, I don't know how. Maybe it'll be after the millennium, but let's just see how things go. But further and further and further away from what they used to be, including, they don't care about Independence, Jackson County, as the place for Zion anymore. They don't hold that belief. They're headquartered here simply because they did believe that at one time. But, now they're just here because, that's what history was. And now they want to move forward. The name of this podcast is Stacy D. Cram's motto, Onward. Let me just remind you of what she said shortly after she was ordained. This was in an interview with Salt Lake Tribune. Excuse me. You can find this on YouTube. Posted by the Salt Lake Tribune. Stacy D. Cram, the first woman to lead the Community of Christ, discusses her reborn church. I'm just going to read some of the red highlights. Interviewer, you mentioned your college education experience. What do you think that educational training, how that's helped you in your ministry? And then she says, so engineers are problem solvers. And so we look at situations and sometimes it's things that are broken and we try to figure out how to fix them. Now, they do have a money problem. We all know that. That's why they sold the Kirtland Temple. I recently did a Facebook post that talks about the 3 major transfers of property. I just found out recently that they used to own Hans Mill. And in 2012, we purchased it from them. In fact, it happened the day before the Kansas City, Missouri temple was dedicated. We bought the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon. That was in another sale. I think that was the second one. And then the most recent one was the Kirtland Temple and Nauvoo properties and artifacts and other things. So they have the money problem that she's probably alluding to here as far as like problems that need to be fixed. But I think it's also the continuation of this plan right here, because these are essentially a plan of how to change the church into something else, to get rid of the past and move into something completely different. So I think she's talking about that as well, because let's read further. And so you learn to imagine the world, or in her case, the church, Community of Christ, in a way of what it could be, not just what it is. And then she talks about the concept of prophetic imagination, which is, I don't know if she coined that term or if it comes from somewhere else, but she's talked about prophetic imagination and prophetic agility. These terms are used when she's talking about the uncertainty of the future, but how the church can create a new future, in that they need to be agile and flexible to make the moves that they're gonna make. All right, continuing. She says, but it is what we can imagine, and then is it possible to make that happen? What does God want the world to be? How do we imagine it? And then how do we make it happen? Later on, she says, community of Christ is in decline along with the rest of Christianity. But one person said, and I didn't hear her say it directly, but she said something akin to, this doesn't feel like a church that's dying. This feels like a church that's being reborn. And I would underscore that. So I'm all but certain that this has reference to they used to be our LDS. Um, all these things that we hold, or not all these things, but a lot of these things that we hold dear, like the age of accountability, the importance of the priesthood, being the one true church, and then Jesus Christ himself actually being a Messiah, or being the Messiah, being the Savior of the world. All those things from the past dying, but a new church being reborn, going a completely new direction. They don't talk about things like the atonement of Jesus Christ and sin and repentance and salvation. Um, they don't talk about the Book of Mormon. They don't talk about Joseph Smith. Well, they did recently, actually, on the Center Place um, YouTube channel. But basically, they talked about the Sacred Grove in that experience in James 1:5, but how in Community of Christ interpretation, that's been completely misinterpreted by us and other restoration churches, that it just means that you can receive personal revelation, but it was never meant to be like a prophet who receives revelation for the entire church. And they frame that as being authoritarian. Like what we're doing right now is authoritarian by having President Oaks as the president of the church who receives revelation for the church. Although we also can receive personal revelation, and you receive revelation for that, that for which you have stewardship over. Like if you're the bishop or stake president, you receive revelation for your stake, for your ward. We receive revelation as parents for our families. You receive personal revelation. But okay, so anyway, let's continue on. I'm going to skip down. She talks about her motto being onward, which I think is the theme of her presidency and what is going to happen while she's president of the church. And then the interviewer asks, so a final question, what are your hopes, dreams, plans for the future? And then she said, President VZ, our previous president, he did this fabulous job in providing us this great foundation and really re-establishing who we are. So again, I don't know how much of this they've implemented. It seems like they've made a lot of progress from what I can tell. I don't know what the ultimate goal is or what they're shooting for. But Stacey D. Cram says that he laid a great foundation for re-establishing who we are. Getting rid of the past, becoming something new. Continuing. And now we need to put it into action. And so my hope is that we've gotten beyond what you might call our phase of identity crisis. I'm pretty sure that has reference to the schism. I don't know if there are people that have kind of like stayed with Community of Christ, but they're not happy with the direction of it, but they weren't happy enough to where they broke off and joined the restoration branches. There must be people like that. And with what we're about to go over in this recent episode of the Onward podcast, it seems like there are still those people that haven't quite made the decision to leave Community of Christ. They've hung in there for some reason. But my hope is that we've gotten beyond what you might call our phase of identity crisis, and it's really clear who Community of Christ is in the world today. So essentially, look, we are now past the fight. You know, this side, we won, and that should be clear. We're done with the past. Okay, so let's go to episode 7 of their podcast, Onward. And I'm going to read some of the transcript. I've added this to my spreadsheet called Timeline Missouri, or it used to be called Timeline Missouri. I actually changed it to Timeline Church in Missouri. This tracks developments of our church in Missouri. That's initially how it started, but I realized we have to look at these other splinter groups as well. We need to see how things have progressed among them because, like I said, they own key property that's needed for prophecy to be fulfilled. And I expect that it's going to happen in a natural way. It may not be until after the second coming, so I'm not like saying that this has to happen right now. But their history is connected to ours. I've heard some of you call them our theological cousins, and they are. We do have a common heritage. So I have this spreadsheet to track them and Church of Christ Temple Lot, and there's some other smaller groups that I want to track as well. But those are the big three: us, them, and Church of Christ Temple Lot. Let's do this really quick. Let me just show you a couple things. So I've added the, let me see. Let me make sure I don't need to go back further. Okay, so things really seem to take off with the position papers in 1967 and 1968 under Prophet President W. Wallace Smith. Later on, you had the presidential papers that came out January of 1979, but this was now under Wallace B. Smith. I think that's the son of W. Wallace Smith. I have to double check. Now, things really took off with him. April of 1984, he introduced a section of Doctrine and Covenants, 156, which allows for women to be ordained to the priesthood. And the following year, the RLDS Church began ordaining women to the priesthood. He passed away 1989, and then in 1990, that was his father, W. Wallace Smith, passed away. 1990, ground was broken for the RLDS Temple, which my current understanding is that the Restoration Branch people don't believe that that temple should exist. That's not part of the original plan. And they're right. The ones that I spoke to at the Restoration Bookstore, they were aware of the 24 temple complex, in that those temples are supposed to look like the Kirtland Temple, 24 of them. So this by itself is a further departure, creating the spiral temple. And then I just learned, as we're about to go through what I want to go over in this video, I learned that in June of 1994, they changed from passing the sacrament, administering the sacrament only to like members of the church, to having it be an open communion, so that just anybody can take the sacrament. This comes from 3 Nephi 18. And now behold, this is the commandment which I give unto you, that ye shall not suffer anyone knowingly to partake of my flesh and blood unworthily, when ye shall when ye shall minister it. And whoso eateth and drinketh my flesh and blood unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to his soul. Therefore, if ye know that a man is unworthy to eat and drink of my flesh and blood, ye shall forbid him. Which, of course, this scripture doesn't really make sense to them anymore, because it doesn't seem like they believe in commandments or the concept of unworthiness, damnation. So it's like, it doesn't matter. You can read more about it here. This is from the Wayback Machine on archive.org. But this is like something that they published on the church website, talking about, okay, now we're going to do open communion. So I'm sure that probably upset some people. And then this was a big one. April of 1996, W. Grant McMurray became the next prophet president. And in their tradition, the prophet president was always supposed to be a descendant of the Smith family, but he was not. So now that was big, because it's like the whole reason why their church started was because after the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, they thought that that a son of Joseph Smith was supposed to be the next prophet president, and they chose Joseph Smith III. And they waited until he grew up, and it wasn't until 1860 that he was ordained the prophet president of their church. So that was like one of the big distinctions for them between their church and our church. But they did away with that in 1996, and then they changed their name to Community of Christ on April 6th of 2001. That was obviously huge as well. November 2010, the National Council of Churches approved the Community of Christ as a voting member. I need to study more about that, but that's part of them being an ecumenical church, just being part of this like club of Christian churches. And then the most recent things, Stacey D. Cram becoming the first female prophet president last year on June 1st. I was here to see that. I got to meet her right after that conference session was over. They went over to the temple, the World Plaza is what it's called, and they had a reception thing for her there. And now we're going to talk about this most recent thing that has to do with the age of accountability and dual membership with other denominations, and they're just further changing things, or at least right now they're contemplating. They're seriously contemplating changing some things. So we have their whole First Presidency, Stacey D. Cram, Bunda C. Chibwe, and Janae C. Grover. And they are joined by Robin Linkhart, a former apostle and currently team lead for the Theological Formation team. I'm not sure what a theological formation team is, other than what it sounds like. I don't know if they have the mission to continue to implement this plan and maybe the things that Stacey D. Cram was talking about, the foundation that was laid by the previous prophet president, VZ. But they're talking to her, and she says, I'm currently serving on the Mission Center president team for Cedar Valley Nauvoo mission. They have these things called missions, but I think that the equivalent of a mission is like in our church, how we have areas of the church. Like I'm in the United States Central area. So I think that's what those are. I'm not sure. It's either like that or it's like a stake. Anyway, so Stacey D. Cram brings up that there was a resolution that was passed in the World Conference last year, Resolution 1324. And she says, that's the resolution on baptism in membership, which was adopted back April 24th, 2023. Oh, sorry. I think I misspoke. That's okay. That's when it was. Okay, so they're working on this. It was passed in 2023 or adopted in 2023. But that resolution stated that the World Conference requests that the president of the church to give additional prayer and study seeking divine guidance on persons who were baptized before the age of 8 becoming members of Community of Christ via confirmation after having attained the age of 8. Now, from what I understand here, the question is, look, you have somebody that joined our church. Say it's like someone that is Catholic and it's the parents and their child was baptized into the Catholic Church when they were a baby. But now they're with Community of Christ. Does the baby really need to be rebaptized? Or once they reach the age of 8, can they simply be confirmed a member of Community of Christ? Can we just skip the rebaptism? It seems like that's the issue. She goes on to talk about a survey that they did among church members of Community of Christ. And she said, the data reveals a community holding somewhat deeply polarized convictions. Nearly 2/3 of respondents expressed support for allowing confirmation only. Okay, so you have a majority that's for that. Yet, approximately 75% of all responses sit at the extreme poles of no support and full support. So, in other words, the overall feeling, the majority says, yes, we're leaning that way. We should allow them to just skip rebaptism. But if you take the people that voted, there weren't very many people that were like middle ground people. Like either you were like for it or you were against it. At least 75% of the people were like that. They were at the extremes. They were polarized. Okay, later on, this is Robin Linkhart. And she says, many explored the relationship between believer baptism, talking of members of the church. Many explored the relationship between believer baptism and the lived reality of committed Christians baptized in other traditions, questioning if requiring baptism denies Christ's work already present in their lives. Questions were raised about whether age 8 truly reflects when a person understands a covenant commitment, along with strong calls for robust education and meaningful confirmation. So it seems like, and it's kind of hard for me to follow along what they're saying. Maybe it's because I'm not a member of their church, and if I was more familiar with their um, terminology and jargon, maybe this would be clearer to me. But it seems like what they're saying is like, look, even the age of accountability is in question, because maybe that needs to change too. Maybe we need to change the age of accountability. So that, okay, so first we were talking about the need to be rebaptized. In our church, it's absolutely essential. We do believe that we're the one true church, and that these covenants have actual meaning. They're not just rituals. They're not just a flowery thing to do. It's not just like outwardly telling people, yes, I choose to follow Jesus Christ. It's a deeply personal and divine commitment that you're actually making with Jesus Christ. And it's going to determine what happens in the afterlife. When I was talking to the Restoration Branch people, they were talking about the fact that Community of Christ doesn't really talk about the afterlife anymore. Like there's not really an afterlife theology. And I knew that back when I interviewed the former president of the Council of the 12 Apostles of Community of Christ. Her name is Linda L. Booth. I have that on my special guests playlist if you want to find it. But she didn't really have an answer for me of what happens after life. I asked about resurrection, and she gave me kind of like a non-answer, like, well, I don't know. You'll probably be like a spirit with God. But it was just like there was no certainty. There was no theological certainty about what happens after this life. So, but for us, we do know what's going to happen. We know what the possibilities are and what you need to do to end up in the place where you want to be. The goal is to achieve exaltation in the celestial kingdom. Everyone is going to end up inheriting one of three kingdoms of glory, either the telestial, that's the lowest, the terrestrial, or the celestial. And if you're in the celestial, you're going to live in the presence of God. And that's what we want to do. And that's what we're encouraging people to do. But in order to get there, you have to be an actual disciple of Jesus Christ. You have to covenant to live this lifestyle, to adopt these values, to become like Christ, to become charity and patience and love and kindness and forgiveness and mercy and all the things that we're taught in the scriptures. But you need to formally become a member of his church. And it starts with baptism, and then you become a member with confirmation. But you have to do those two things. And the age of accountability, as you may or may not know, it comes from Doctrine and Covenants 68, verse 27. I can't remember if it's in the Book of Mormon as well. I don't think so, because when you click on the footnote, it doesn't bring up a corresponding scripture. But Doctrine and Covenants 68, 27. And their children shall be baptized for the remission of their sins when 8 years old, and receiving the laying on of hands. This comes from the Lord. These are the Lord's words. They were given through Joseph Smith, but these are the actual words of the Lord. And that's another thing that I don't think they really believe in is actual prophets, the way that we do, where they actually receive the words of the Lord. It's not just like an ambiguous, like, well, it feels like we should do this, or, no, that he literally speaks to his prophets. I checked on their website. They also have Doctrine and Covenants, but they like break up the verses in a different way. And at a certain point, they begin writing their own sections of Doctrine and Covenants. But I found the place where this would be in theirs, and it's there. It's in their scriptures. And the scriptures that they do reference somewhat frequently are the Bible and Doctrine and Covenants. But whenever I've heard them bring up the Doctrine and Covenants, it's always their sections, like the later sections of Doctrine and Covenants. I don't think I've heard them reference the older ones that were given at the time of Joseph Smith, but it's there. So they're looking to change that. It's a further progression of this path that they're on. It feels like, I mean, I don't know. You could probably think about this in different ways, but it feels like kind of like a controlled demolition. In my opinion, Community of Christ essentially, or the RLDS essentially died back in the 60s and the 70s. And then I'd say it was pretty well finalized in the 80s with the ordination of women to the priesthood. But that church like no longer exists. It's in a methodical way. It's been demolished, and it seems like the demolition is continuing. One thing that I didn't say with these papers is that what was supposed to happen is that they were, and I guess they were used for like curriculum, like Sunday school curriculum, or whatever it is they do in their church, Sunday school or other like church manuals. The Herald, like that's their version of the Liahona. Like those started to incorporate these new beliefs. And it's been like a process that's been ongoing, and it seems like it's still happening now, but it seems like it's been essentially a controlled demolition. Okay, so let's go back to this. I probably don't need to read. I mean, there's a lot that's been said here, but essentially you can pause and read this. I'm just going to summarize it. Essentially, they're like, look, do we really need to rebaptize people in general? Like putting the infant baptisms aside. If you have somebody that really believes in Christ and they're part of another tradition, they're already a committed disciple, do we really need to rebaptize them? And also we need to look at creative new ways of membership, of like church membership. The idea was floated that maybe there could be like a dual membership, because they have people that interact with the church. They call them like friends of the church, who aren't ready to make that leap, but they probably would accept like a dual membership, which is really interesting because the effect that this would have in any of these scenarios, whether it's like an infant baptism, or whether it was someone who likes the church, but they're not really wanting to like give up their previous membership, but they would accept a dual membership. Or whether it's somebody that would want to become a member of the church, a full-fledged member of the church, but they just don't want to get rebaptized. In those three scenarios, if they make these changes and that's what happens, this would essentially increase their numbers, like their total membership, which would look better on paper. It would essentially be a way of like padding the numbers. Let's go to my spreadsheet called Timeline Missionary Work. This is primarily to track our own church and church growth and such. But I also wanted to compare these other churches over here in columns AG and AH. So the last number that I've been able to find about uh, the size of Community of Christ membership is quote unquote approximately 250,000. And that comes from Community of Christ themselves. This was a consolidated financial report dated December 31st, 2020. That's the last number I've been able to find. But if you go back in time, we go back to the earliest number that I have, which goes back to 1994. Back then, it was only 248. So they've essentially just like plateaued, at least since 1994. I have some more work to do. I think I have more that I can add to this, but I'm just gonna have to do it when I have free time. But they've essentially plateaued, and if it's actually starting to go down, which it very well could be, they might want to reverse that. And this might also be a way to get more tithe payers, because that number for sure is going down. We've put that on a graph one time. I don't have that up right now, but it's like a 45-degree angle, like, well, depending on how you lay out the graph, but it's like a nosedive. It is truly a nosedive of tithe payers. And if the trend continues on that same trajectory, they're not going to have any tithe payers by 2030, as early as 2030, if that trend continues. So it would increase the size of their church, technically, or at least on paper, and it might bring in some tithe payers. I wonder if that's why they're doing this. I don't know. In comparison, just as a reminder, our church last year had a record-breaking year of new converts. These are not children of record. That's in column H. So children of record are just simply children that are born into the church. Okay, new converts. These are new converts. So record-breaking number 385,000. That's the most in this dispensation, and that's more than Community of Christ has total right now. I think I calculated it one time. Let me just do it really quick. You're not going to be able to see the calculator, but let's do 385, 490 divided by 150, or divided by 250,000. That's like one and a half. It's like one and a half the size of Community of Christ. That's how many joined the church in just 1 year. And Elder Rasband said that this year is far exceeding the pace of last year. So almost certainly there's going to be another record broken. But that's like what you would expect with a church that doesn't do missionary work. Like they call these like areas or these things missions, but they're not like proselyting missions. They're not knocking on doors. They're not doing missionary work the way that we do. It's so interesting. It's almost like an experiment in a way. Like if you think about the fact that the church, began in New York, and then it got up until Nauvoo, and then that first president of the church was martyred. But then it's like an experiment after that point. You have these different groups that break away from each other. The vast majority of them go with the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, led by Brigham Young. They go to Utah. The majority of the church goes there. But then you see the aftermath with these other groups. Some have gone extinct, like the Cutlerites, otherwise known as the Church of Jesus Christ. But I think they have like a couple members that still maintain like their one building, but it is literally just like 8 people. They've gone extinct. You have Church of Christ Temple Lot, which the last number that I have for the size of their church is just 6,000. They're the ones that own the primary temple lot. And then Church of Christ, that's done better. They've done like the second best, but they're only at 250,000. There's so much I could say about it, but it's just fascinating. So I'm very curious what else is going to happen with their church, what other things are going to change. They are very aware that there are people that do not want more change. And, if they were to do this, if they were to make a change with rebaptisms, dual membership, the age of accountability, I wonder if that would lead to further schisms. But I imagine it wouldn't be on the scale that main one was in the 80s, but I wonder if that would make more people want to leave their church. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. They did say that they want to do this like slow. They don't want to rush it, but the tone of the podcast made it seem like, yeah, this is going to happen. And I think that's a pretty good assumption because that is what's been happening since the 60s. There's a trend. There's like a solid trend that whatever the old tradition was, at one point or another, it's going to be abandoned. Again, because I think it's supposed to be a controlled demolition. I don't really. It seems like all the things that they still do that might be similar to our church, like the concept of having a first presidency, I think they just view it as tradition, and that's it. I don't think that they think. I mean, they might say that like it's inspired of God, but I don't think that they would say that it came by like direct revelation. Because like whenever they talk about the first vision, they seem to downplay that and make it seem like, well, Joseph Smith thought that he saw God the Father and Jesus Christ, and we call that the first vision. But they really, really downplay it. So it's like you have remnants, like little pieces from the original church, but it's just like, it's basically just like a skeleton crew at this point. It's like the bare minimum to still call it anything that would resemble what it originally was. Sorry, maybe that's not like the, I'm maybe not so great with my words right now. But anyway, so this is the latest. I'll report to you whenever there's big developments, but I want to keep an eye on what happens with Community of Christ. But that's going to be it for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.